Hi, I'm Joe Quirk. Welcome to the Blue Frontiers podcast about all my favorite things: seasteading, the environment, special economic zones, and innovation in science, technology, governance, and society itself. Today we have Rutger de Graaf Dinter, the civil engineer who independently conceived of seasteading. From the algae-based economies to the decentralized governance, he performed the scientific research, co-founded a company that built the first sustainable floating pavilion in Rotterdam without ever knowing what the word seasteading meant. Rutger showed me that seasteading is an emergent phenomenon happening all over the world at the same time, and now all these aquapreneurs are finding each other through Blue Frontiers. So enjoy your conversation with an original visionary, Rutger de Graaf Dinter.
This was a very difficult podcast to prepare too, because I ended up having 10 pages of notes. And I was struggling with, how can I reduce these 10 pages of notes to simple questions? Because I read all your PhD thesis, which got to me thanks to Joe Quirk. Actually, he said, you need to talk to Rutger. He is a visionary of seasteading, and he's in a very interesting middle point between civil engineering and governance, which not many people are.
That's quite a special combination indeed, yes.
Yes, and I was really surprised when I read your PhD thesis that not only you spoke about governance, but also about complex systems.
True.
Yes, and one thing that I noticed was that you approach the complexity of cities and of amphibious architecture from the perspective of, okay, this complexity is here, we need to harness it. And yes.
I think so, because in the end you're dealing with sociotechnical systems. It's not only technology, you're dealing with people, legislation, all sort of things.
Yes.
And of course, in particular, if your objective is to move to sustainable cities, you're dealing with all these different domains. It's not only water management, but also energy, transportation. It's how people, the behavior of people.
Yes.
So I think if you reduce the complexity too much, you lose the essence of the. So I think it's first about understanding the complexity and then see how you can not manage it, because complexity cannot really be managed, but how you can make interventions to influence the system and continuously monitoring that.
Exactly.
And these insights I really got from my collaboration, mostly outside of the TU Delft, because of course I'm a civil engineer, but from the outside of even my master's project, and in particular my PhD project, the objective was not only to study technical feasibility and economic feasibility, because I assumed that would be enough to get things implemented, but I found out it was absolutely not the case.
No.
But also really the transition management approach, the governance approach, and therefore I worked together in the beginning and still, I have to say, mainly also with the Rotterdam University, where they have a Dutch Research Institute for Transitions. So I wrote a lot of papers together with them, and from them I learned a lot about these kind of topics, but also from other people. And that made it very interesting.
Well, the subject is interesting.
But also hard for a civil engineer, because I didn't have a really background in this field, of course. So it was quite a hard study to deliver something at PhD thesis level. That would, because in the end, of course, experts are going to look at it and you need to get it accepted. But in the end, that worked out. But it was a lot of work for sure.
But there are not many experts in this area. You have positioned yourself as one of the main global leading authorities of amphibious and floating infrastructure. So I have a very simple first question for you, and that I'm sure everybody who is listening to us for the first time wants to know, and it's, why floating? Why should
That's a very good question, of course. The simplest answer is why not, but that's not. Because if you look at the planet, it's 70% water, it's 30% land. So yes, well, if you want to live somewhere, you could also live on the ocean. And I definitely think it's a more short-term feasible option than living on the moon, on Mars, and also a much more pleasant option.
Yes.
But I suppose coming from the Netherlands is not. It's a kind of a logical step for us. We have always been fighting to the water already for hundreds of years by building dikes, windmills, pumping stations. I grew up in a city 4 meters below the sea level as a child.
Me too. And it
Yeah, so you know, when starting to study civil engineering, of course, much of the courses I got was still traditional Dutch water management, like pumping stations, dikes, but also was an increasing interest also for innovation. So, and I thought, well, I found those innovations most interesting. So the water management, but also the more adaptive approaches. So you could say that we're in a transition from historically the Dutch are fighting the water. In the past 20, 30 years, there was more attention for living with the water.
Yes.
And now the next step is living on the water.
Yes. I love that.
So it's basically a condition, a next step in our tradition, if you will.
Yes.
And I do think that we shouldn't debate whether to live on the land or on the sea. We should come up with smart ideas which functions could be placed best on the land and which functions could be best placed on the sea. Well, I think for biofuels, to me, it's quite clear that algae, seaweed, floating seaweed systems are more efficient per square meter than crops on the land, and they do not compete with food production so much. They do not need fresh water, no pesticides, no artificial fertilizers. So I think so for those kind of functions, it's quite logical. I also think that many coastal cities are already along the coast. They're facing land scarcity. They're struggling to expand. Well, then also I think making floating buildings, floating neighborhoods, and in the end floating cities is also quite a logical next step. And of course, there are also cities where it's not such an obvious option. So every situation is different. We need to critically assess the different local conditions. But I think so. I see floating urban development as a part of the toolbox, and it should be in the toolbox.
Yes.
And now it's often not in the toolbox, whereas that's a missed opportunity. So I think it's very important if coastal cities are talking about climate adaptation that they also have floating urban development in their toolbox.
Yes.
If we're looking at how to achieve the climate agreement of Paris, we should not only look at the land, but also the opportunities of the oceans, because else it will be very difficult to achieve. So there are answers at multiple levels to your questions, but I think these, of course, sea level rise, climate adaptation, they didn't even say that. But of course, it's also very pressing issue for many low-lying cities in coastal areas all over the world. And in particular also for us, but many other cities as well. And then the question is, how can you protect your city? Is it by making higher dikes, or could you also look at more adaptive options?
Yes, I was going to point out that you have worked a lot already on the concept of resilience and how can floating buildings increase their resilience or the capacity to adapt of communities that are coastal. And can you tell us some successful examples anywhere in the world where floating architecture has managed to produce good results? Because I know you're familiarized with cases in Japan and also in the Netherlands.
Yes. So resilience, of course, also, just like sustainability, quite a broad concept.
Yeah.
And in my thesis, I mainly talked about vulnerability, which you could consider the flip side of the coin in a certain way.
Yeah.
But for me, resilience is more than, let's say, the traditional definition of the ability to recover after a flood disaster, for instance.
Yes.
I think it's also part of it is also to recover in a better way than before the flood. That, of course, that you try to use the opportunity to improve, but also to already anticipate on uncertain future changes. I think that's also very important. Resilience is not only about technology; it's also about the social resilience, how communities, how they are they aware of flooding? Do they know what to do if something happens? So that's also an important component, I think. The floating urban development, I think one of the resilience characteristics is the flexibility. So we're living in an uncertain world where you're not knowing what's going to happen, and changes are going more rapidly all the time than before. So I think the ability to be flexible and to adapt is probably a better strategy than try to predict what's going to happen. And I think so the intrinsic flexibility of floating urban development also makes it more resilient. But also, if you look at the Dutch coast, for instance, floods do not only occur because of a high water level, but it's often a combination of wind, water levels, and waves.
Okay.
If you can use floating cities to reduce part of the wave height by absorbing those waves, you can also protect the coastline of our country and other countries. So floating cities in themselves, they adapt to a higher water level. That's already a resilience property, I would say.
Yes.
They can also protect the coastline. And I think also there's also infrastructure part of it. I think that centralized infrastructure is very efficient, but is also very vulnerable. So a very simple example, if you have like one drinking water production for a country, will probably be could be quite efficient if it's a small country. It could also be quite cheap. But if it goes wrong, you have a major impact and major problem. I think that floating cities, they are more suitable for decentralized solutions. So you could organize water supply for a floating neighborhood or a floating house even. And then, of course, it might be a little bit less efficient because you need multiple installations. They will be smaller, but in the end might be a little bit more expensive. But if one installation fails, it doesn't have a major citywide impact. And you see the same with electricity, wastewater treatment, internet connections, all those kind of things.
And it has to do with the network structure.
Yeah, so I did a lot of research on vulnerability, and I found that distributed systems, so that are not centralized, distributed systems that are connected, and they can reduce the vulnerability of a city.
Yes.
And therefore increase their resilience. And I think it's more obvious for floating cities to apply decentralized solutions than cities on the land. And why? Because we already have the legacy systems. We have our sewer systems is 100-year-old, and it's very, very hard to replace it by decentralized wastewater management, even if it would be a better option. And of course, with a floating city, you can start with all the state-of-the-art systems. I think in the end, by doing that, they will also be more better positioned to compete with systems on the land because the price will go down. So I think there are a couple of, I probably didn't mention all of them, but a couple of properties of floating cities that can make them very, very suitable to increase the resilience, not only of the floating city itself, but also of the rest of society.
Yes, and you emphasize mainly on the infrastructure side of it, but if we decentralized and distributed governance infrastructures, then also the distributed network topology, that also makes the system more robust, because if you randomly attack a node, just as it happens with electricity systems,
exactly.
Then the chances of a big problem cascading are lower. So if you have a centralized government and you know where to attack, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's very vulnerable. It's very vulnerable.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I think, and that's what really admire about the work that seasteading is doing, and also the political experiments and the new innovations in terms of political systems. And that's basically the same story. And I think there's an interesting link between the two, because I think that decentralized infrastructure also offers opportunities to make for decentralized decision making.
Yeah.
So at the moment, I'm a customer of a very big water company, and basically once a year I check how much cubic meters I used, and then fill it in on a website, and they send me an invoice, and that's it.
Okay.
So it gives me I'm a very passive consumer.
Yeah.
But if I would organize my own water management together with my neighbors or my streets, I would be much more involved.
Yes.
And, also, the big company wouldn't have power over me, over my water supply.
No.
So I think that if you produce your own energy, your own water, you're already much more independent in a political sense than if you you're very dependent on big utility companies, for instance.
Yes.
I think there's a very interesting link between decentralized, sustainable water systems and energy systems and political independence or governance innovation.
Actually, Elinor Ostrom, the economics prize, it's not Nobel Prize, but it's more or less equivalent to Nobel Prize.
Mm-hmm.
She worked on governance on the commons. And her main thesis was that self-organized institutions for managing collective or common pool resources such as oceans or dikes or rivers produce better results than if you have a nation state centrally controlling it and without really knowing all the particular characteristics of the problem itself.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. And I think we also have to be aware of the time that we're living in. And many people have a very high education. The access to information and technology has been better than ever before. And of course, at the end of the 19th century, when many of these centralized systems evolved, like the sewer system and the drinking water system, there was a big urgency. Cities were growing rapidly. People were at a very low education, were living in very poor conditions. So the government had to do something to fix that. So in that time, also they didn't have all the decentralized options at the time. So in that time, it was very, very logical step to have big decentralized systems that were set up by the government. Today, we have a much more technical innovation. We have people that know much more. And so then it's probably much more efficient to have decentralized systems that people have much more to say about. And the same is with architecture and designing your own house. And you're often now a consumer of a big project developer or social housing corporation, but collective groups of citizens, they can start designing their own neighborhoods with the help of architects, of course. But I think there's much more influence of people on their own living environment and much more, they will be much more involved in the management, I think, also of these living environments.
What role do you think that public-private partnerships can play in the decentralization of governance when it comes to floating infrastructure?
Yes, I think in particular, of course, in the period when we are now, we're more or less in a transition from the very centralized government systems towards more, I think it's very important. And in all the projects I did, I worked very closely with the government and the city government of Rotterdam when we were doing the floating pavilion, and in Delft with the floating neighborhoods, we also worked very closely with them. And with, in that case, also the citizens that developed their own house. So I do think that is very important, in particular if you want to innovate, you need the collaboration. In the current phase, you definitely need the collaboration of city authorities, but depending on the skill you're working on, maybe also regional or national authorities. I think that's very important. And without that, it's difficult now at the moment to realize a floating project. Very difficult.
What are the main things that make it so hard?
Yes, well, legislation is always comes from the past, and it's yes, it's not usually people don't write legislation and thinking forward what kind of innovations there might be, and so I think the technology is always further than the legislation, and that's very understandable. I think also stability and resistance is a property of a healthy, complex system.
Yes.
So it's also, you can complain about it, and many innovators do, but I see resistance to innovations. At first, I see it as an indicator that I'm still working in an innovative way. If everyone would agree, probably it's not innovative enough. But also, I think some resistance is good, because else every crazy idea would be implemented right away and it would be chaos.
Okay.
So I think it's a property of a complex system. But of course, if you want to achieve something, we need to deal with it. And it's many people, they are conservative. They want to keep everything the same. And you have a small group of pioneers that want to change something. So it's always a struggle for the pioneers to convince enough people and create the possibility to achieve something in practice, I think.
You have mentioned in the past a relation that not many people, again, see. You're a visionary, like Joe Quirk says. You have talked a lot about how can engineering achieve freedom?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Well, I think the link with what we discussed previously, so the link between decentralized systems and let's say, political independence, that's a very interesting one. So how can citizens have more influence on their own life by being owner and manager of their own water supply, for instance? I think that's something.
So
so I think technology can be used in multiple ways, in very good ways, but of course also less favorable ways, for sure. I mean, and it's about how you apply it and how you can work with it, what the impact will be.
exactly. And that's where the value of experimentation comes from. Because if you have little small experiments, instead of experimented at a large scale, then if failure happens, it doesn't distribute.
Absolutely. I agree. I think it's a good way of risk management. It's also easier to convince people for a small pilot than for a very big project. It's difficult enough, for sure, but it's that's what my experience is. But also, I think one critical thing we should not forget is also we need to develop strategies how to scale up our experiments, because only with experiments it's not going to happen. So we need to find out mechanisms how to learn from pilot projects or experiments, and that's often lacking. So what you often see is that, and that was also the case in the project we worked on, that the let's say the pilot project or the innovation is a goal in itself, and that we consider a success if it's done, if it's delivered, if it's finished. But if you really want to start competing with, let's say, mainstream, large, outdated systems, we need to improve the quality of our experiments and also increase their skill. And therefore, it's very important that within the design of pilot projects, there's also an important role for monitoring and learning during the process, but also afterwards. So that we can learn from the experiment, also what went wrong, and be open about that and try to achieve a better quality next time. Because that increases the likelihood that these experiments in the end will be scaled up and will be able to compete with the mainstream system.
Yes.
And else they are more like, let's say, the pet projects, like everyone thinks it's very cute and nice, and we all go there to make a nice picture, and we invite tourists to go there with the bus, but in the end, at the same time, the current mainstream system just continues. So I think it's very important that in the end, our innovative projects are well enough developed so that they will really be able to compete with the mainstream fossil fuel-based centralized systems. And that's something that's often forgotten. And then you end up with an also nice collection with all sorts of pilot projects. But the impact on the overall system is too limited.
Yes. Rutger, I'm really happy that you mentioned that, because I have here highlighted one phrase, one of my favorite phrases of you. And I'm going to read. It says, over the last decade, there has been a shift from the top-down hierarchical steering governments to network-driven decentralized forms of policymaking. With multiple actors and that floating cities offer an opportunity to take this development a step further by using the opportunities that decentralized
horizon. And I think in general, the shift from centralized governments to decentralized governance has been observed by many scientists and scholars. And it's not something that I invented, of course, but I read a lot of literature about it, and then I found out that and we can also see it around us, that in general the power of the nation state is declining. Cities are becoming more important, but also the international organizations are getting more important. But also, what you also now see in the Netherlands, for instance, is, and I like that also a lot, is collective groups of citizens that start to organize and buy their own solar panels, and they start making their own energy corporations.
I love it.
On a very small scale. The same could happen with water management.
That's awesome.
So I think the decentralized, it's already happening. And of course, floating cities could accelerate that process. So the way I see it now, and I think how it also has been visualized by Blue 21 I think even the centerfold of the book of joke work, is this development of this city. It's a lovely picture, I think, that Bart Roeven made, my colleague. So at the moment, we're still concentrated, let's say, in inland waters, protected waters, and then you will always be a part of a city government or city legislation. I think not too far from now, our research is more shifting towards maritime conditions. We're now in a really big European project called Space at Sea, where we, it's with Marin, one of the most renowned maritime research institutes, at least in the Netherlands, probably also in the world, where we really start to develop the technical feasibility of making large floating platforms at the North Sea. And North Sea has one of the most hostile wave conditions in the world. So it's like starting at one of the most difficult areas.
Wow.
So I think technology probably is already there, but we are developing it further and making really the case proven scientifically that it will be possible to make floating cities, floating neighborhoods in front of the coast. This will be already the next step.
I know it.
Well, if you can do that, then it's a logical next step would be to move further out from the coast and in the end up in the international waters, like what has been the vision of the seasteading as well. Yeah, then you could have the city-states. And what fascinates me about that is that democracy more or less evolved in Greece with the city-states, and now you could have city-states on the water.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a nice making the circle round again. And of course, life also started at the oceans, and we're getting back to the ocean. So there are a couple of circular developments there as well. So that makes it very interesting, I think.
With the difference that this time not only men above 18 who have served military service.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's very good. And also, of course, the Greek form of democracy was also limited.
Yeah.
But in that time it was quite revolutionary, of course. And I wouldn't also use it as an example, but it's the kind of a historical parallel you could make.
I like it.
Yeah. So we're getting back to that. And perhaps it's much easier to manage something the size of a city.
Yes.
Than a really large country, and that's also the case made by Joe Quirk in his book, I think. Cities like Singapore, or also the special economic zones like Shenzhen in China, and there are a couple of others that he mentions. They're very successful, and much more successful than the really large states with the big bureaucracies.
Yes.
Floating cities could add a lot of those kind of entities, I think.
Yes, all the research on complex systems points to the fact that you cannot manage a large system in a centralized way, because especially and afterwards making top-down decisions, because there is no way, absolutely no way on earth in which you can make an optimal decisions that would satisfy everybody's desires equally.
Exactly. Yeah.
And even if you could, there is no way at all in which you can know all the information of all the interactions in a moment of time.
People at the top of the pyramid, they're often shielded from information because the people below in the pyramid, they have no incentive of sharing information upwards. And in very authoritarian systems, only the good news goes up. And then the bad news stays filtered out somewhere during the process. So it's very inefficient. And
exactly.
I think we can also learn a lot from ecology. Ecology also consists of complex systems.
Yes.
You don't see so much hierarchical systems in nature.
No.
Probably because in the end, evolution got rid of that, or it's probably not the most efficient way to do it.
There are hierarchies, but not in the sense of top-down control. There are hierarchies in terms of levels of organization. For example, in the human body, there are cells, there are tissues, there are organs, there are. Then you have a human. The human is part of the whole ecosystem. But there is information processing from all levels to all levels. My cells regulate. For example, my heart is composed of cells, and it is processing information at a cellular level, but also it's processing information at an organ level. And
so it's interaction of different skills and
exactly.
That's also a complex system, and it works most of the time. I also know that, and I also have experienced cases with my own in my own situation that didn't work. But in the most of 99% of all cases, it works perfectly. And I think hierarchical management originated from the military, where probably that's one of the very few cases where hierarchical steering does make sense, because everyone's going to do his own thing,
Yeah.
might not be such a good idea.
Makes sense.
But to apply that type of hierarchical management to an entire society is, I think there's a lot of evidence that it doesn't work very well.
No. Yes. No. And I am. So some people would say that this all sounds very nice in theory, but that is very hard to take into practice.
Sure. Yeah. That's I've been working on it for 12 years now, and absolutely. Yeah.
Nothing has changed.
Yeah. Well, yeah, a lot has changed.
Oh,
yeah.
what has changed
Well, when we started in 2006, 2007. 2006 we started as a student team, and then in 2007 we founded Deltasing, our first company. People were still there were two reactions. They were both kind of skeptical. The first reaction was like, hey, what's new? We have houseboats ready for hundreds of years in the Netherlands, and nothing innovative about that.
Okay.
And the second reaction was, yeah, dream on, it's never going to happen. So those were basically the two things.
Oh.
But fortunately, there were enough people that did see the possibilities. And of course, it was the city of Rotterdam that gave us the chance in the end to realize the floating pavilion.
And it's beautiful.
Since we have realized the floating pavilion, I never got the houseboat question again. So in the beginning, every presentation I gave, I always got the houseboat question. Like, what's the difference? What's new? But after the floating pavilion, people could see for themselves that it's a totally different skill, totally different function, a new type of building. So people can see for themselves that, and then they say, hey, if you can make a houseboat and you can make a floating pavilion, you can make basically a lot of different things on the water.
Yes.
So then the imagination of people was stimulated in a certain way, and I never got that question again. And the second one, like, you're crazy, it's never going to happen, I still get it sometimes, but less than when we started. Because so it is important to show people real examples and to show that even if it's only small to the ambition that you have. So I think it's very important if you want to realize something to have a big vision for the future.
Yes.
But also show what you can do with it tomorrow, and then so to define tangible short-term steps that can be achieved. Because else it stays a dream, and then people get demotivated after some time because there are no results. So you need you need to show something.
Yes.
I think that also as an engineer, in the end, I like research, I like doing calculations, and brainstorm about creative ideas, and be involved in designs. But in the end, of course, you want to make something outside.
Yes. Where does Rotterdam Floating City 2035 place here? Because the municipality of Rotterdam has been really, really helpful. They have been so supportive with everything floating that they even have a program for Rotterdam.
Yes. And what I said in 2035 was really, well, it's how Rotterdam became such a good place for companies like ours to start experiments. I even wrote an article on that. You have seen it in my PhD. It's a long-term process, how spatial planning and water management got integrated. Also that Rotterdam in the end recognized water as a very important element to make the city more attractive for people and companies. And of course, climate adaptation became a very important issue because Rotterdam is threatened from four sides. It's threatened from the sea, from the groundwater, from intensive rainstorms, and also from the river. So four sides. So they really had to do something. And they gave us a chance as a start. We didn't even exist 1 or 2 years, I think. Really young company without any sort of track record. They gave us the chance to make such a project in the center of the city.
Wow.
Which, looking back, find it more and more exceptional that happened.
Yes.
And so that's great. And I think that's also, if you're talking about public-private partnerships, or role that cities or governments can play, is to give young people with innovative ideas a chance.
Yes.
And innovate, and not only like the big companies, because they are more interested in doing the same thing over and over again. So I really admire Rotterdam for doing that. Of course, there's also been many plans for floating neighborhoods in Rotterdam that didn't go through for various reasons. Economic crisis was a reason, but also some obstacles with regard to legislation. But the ambitions are definitely there to become a fully resilient city.
Wow.
While also discovering what that exactly means. And floating is definitely a part of that. So they have supported many of our efforts over the past 10 years, and I think that's and they were our launching customer in a certain way as well.
Wow,
So
that's an awesome first.
so they will always be a very special place to us, I think.
Wow. I recently read an article, and I'm going to try to explain this in the most simple way possible. So you mentioned that it is really important to give young people the opportunity to take their ideas into practice. And this article was wondering about the role of luck in success, because if intelligence is can be plotted, so there's an average of intelligence in the world, and outside of that average, there's people who are really smart, and there's other who aren't, right? But most of people can be. However, success doesn't have the same curve. Success is like this. So there's they were talking about economic success, especially economic success. So there is very few people who have huge economic success, while the majority are simply like more atomized. Turns out that if you randomly distribute possibilities to flourish, the whole average state of the system will improve, rather than taking previous metrics for individual success and for company success as the factor that decided whether a company was going to, or a research institute was going to be successful in the future. It's a paper written by some scientists in Italy, Alessandro Pluccino. And
that sounds very interesting. And I think what I could reflect on that is that I don't, and it happens a lot also in my country, I don't believe so much in, let's say, innovation steering by governments. Because you can never predict what's going to be the best technology. And so we have a system of the top sectors in the Netherlands, and those are initiatives from the government with researchers and industry to try to excel at certain domains like agriculture and also water. But actually, I think it's very difficult in a top-down way, sitting in a capital, to predict which technology is going to be the best and where should we invest in. If we want to transition to sustainable energy, should we invest in solar or in wind energy or in something we don't even know yet? Or it's very difficult. So I believe more in, let's say, giving innovators the chance to test and put their things into practice. Some of them will fail. Well, okay, that's also a learning experience. Exactly. But in the end, I think that will lead to more success. So less management of innovation and technology and more, let's say, experimentation ground. And I think then, of course, the entrepreneur does the rest. If people get a chance, they will build up companies, create jobs, make new technologies. And then you don't have to do so much yourself as a government, I think.
Mm-hmm. We are here thanks to failed experiments of nature. If you look back and compare the number of species that are alive today compared to all the species who have extinguished due to natural causes, not human-driven extinctions, like this one we are experimenting that we are experiencing right now, but natural. Then you'll see that it took nature so many randomizations and so many experiments to get to where we are, that we see their failure as failure, as negative. Failure is part of something that will take you.
Well, I'm convinced that you need failure to have success in any type of, also definitely if you're doing a company. We have made many mistakes in the past 10 years, but also, I think it's, also in these kind of evolutionary processes, of course. It's, and we should not think in a very binary way of success and failure. It's often part of the same process, and you need one to achieve the other.
Yes.
You need it to learn as well. So it's important to learn from failures, I think. That's important. And to use it to make other things better.
If you don't fail, you will never reflect about what can you do better. Luckily, we have had many centuries already of failed governance. So in theory, if we start experimenting at this point with new forms of governance, we already know very well what not to do. Right?
Yeah. So some of them will also fail, but there might be also really good systems evolving in these kind of experiments.
Yes, I agree. What for you is the future of seasteading and floating communities? Because you mentioned that at some point, ideally, seasteads will be able, or floating cities will be able to have super international organizations such as the United Nations, or maybe also have a seat in the United Nations. How do you see that floating cities will change the international panorama?
Well, I think by adding a completely new environment, a new system to the what we know now, it's of course difficult to predict 20, 30 years. But I think it's already changing at the moment because if you know, when we started 10 years ago, it was all very small and very Dutch, and now you see people in many countries working on this. Renowned research institutes like Marin starting to work on it, so it's getting much more seriously. And also, I think it was 2016, 2 years ago, no, a little bit longer, 3 years ago, in Rotterdam, I organized a workshop at the International Climate Change Conference on floating cities. And there were policymakers and decision makers from all sorts of countries, Indonesia, from all over the world. Whereas I organized the same workshop 3 years, it was in 2012, I think. Then there were still mainly Dutch people. So I think it's people are getting more aware of this, and I think awareness is really the first step. If you want to change something, people first need to be aware of your solution, because else it's never going to happen. And I think that awareness, that's something that seasteading contributed a lot to. I think with internet, also in the media, and people. And of course, the Book of Joe. We have done a lot of international media interviews as well. So I think people more and more start to recognize and also acknowledge the fact that it's not something of the far future, but it's already happening. So I think that in terms of influencing policymakers, I think that's very important.
It is.
But that's still a long way from the independent city-states on the ocean. But I think if we can create experimentation space to start experimenting both with technical innovation, but also with governance innovation, and not as a threat to current governments, but let's say more as a research program.
Okay.
So if you start to make a floating neighborhood, you want to learn about technology, but you also want to learn about how do people live together, what's their behavior, how do you make sure that they behave they don't make a big mess on that they are responsible for their environment. And I think those kind of research programs that we should start, I think, they will provide a lot of lessons how to make the step after that step.
They will.
And also there might be some failures, things that don't work, but I think if we start experimenting with independence and political autonomy in floating neighborhoods or floating cities at a smaller scale, that will provide the lessons and the steps, what could come next. So I think that's what we should focus on at first, and it's quite difficult for me to, also because I'm not really an expert in international maritime law or international law, to really predict how this city-states in a governance way would work, like 20 or 30 years from now. So I'm always trying to make, to think about the far future, but also the next step. And I think this would be really interesting, to have floating cities with research programs on all these different aspects.
So we've talked about the future a lot. I want us to talk a bit about the past. You've been working on floating architecture for 12 years now. I've been thinking about it even longer. Was this always your childhood dream? What were your childhood dreams?
Yes, that's very well. I've always been very much involved in water and with the environment. So as a child, and still, I was fishing all the time, always busy with water. So that has been kind of from the start. Also, as a child, I was quite concerned already about the environment, what I read about nature, and I also liked very much ecology. I read a lot of books on nature as well. And it was always, I was very fascinated by the idea to, also about nature observation, so to study nature.
Yes.
And And when I got a little bit older, I got more interested in actually making something. So therefore, I think I ended up in engineering rather than studying biology or something.
Okay.
But the funny thing is that through civil engineering and starting with floating cities, in the end, that led to starting a company with underwater drones that's doing ecology observations. So it's quite funny how I chose another path, but in the end, through a very different route, I still I'm now working, and that's, I think, quite amazing how that works. And well, in Dymo, the company that's doing the work on ecology observation with underwater drones, actually evolved from Blue 21 and DeltaSync, because from a very practical problem. That's fascinating how things go sometimes. But we had this very practical problem that we were realizing the small floating neighborhood in Delft, 6 floating houses.
Yes.
But the water authorities, who have quite a big influence in the Netherlands historically, they didn't want to give a permit for that.
Okay.
Because they were very concerned about the water quality. And well, we had discussions on that for more than a year, and it didn't really move forward. So it was difficult also for the people that already bought their plot of water to build their house.
Yes.
But in the end, we agreed that, and we said, well, there has not been really good research on the impact of floating projects on the water quality. There were bits and pieces, but not really applicable to our situation. So in the end, the municipality, the water board, and our company, we agreed to study it.
Awesome.
And yeah, that was quite nice. And they said, well, if you study it, we will give you the permit on the condition that if there are negative impacts, you will do something about it.
Wow.
So we said, okay, well, let's do that. And then we started to study all the projects in the Netherlands, and we involved many other universities and other consultancies. We had a big research consortium and got a little bit of subsidy. But actually, we still didn't know how to measure the impacts, because it's quite difficult to do measurements under a floating house. You cannot really send a diver under it, because the water systems in the Netherlands are generally shallow, and it's very expensive and also not so safe to do that. But then we had this startup meeting, and after a while we had the whole agenda was finished, but we still had to wait half an hour for the lunch.
Okay.
And then because the person who organized it, he ordered the lunch too late. And so half of the people left, but the other half said, yeah, I'm here anyway, and I need to have lunch anyway, so I will wait 30 minutes. But it's in this kind of unpredicted empty time, if you will, that good ideas evolve, because people have nothing to do.
Uh-huh.
Some might go to the toilet or smoke, but others are sitting there and they start having some good ideas. And then somebody said, I don't even know if it was me or somebody else, it doesn't really matter, but somebody said, hey, why don't we send underwater drones under these floating houses? Because then we can do measurements and put all sorts of sensors on it. And that was like a brilliant idea. So we have written an entire project plan about water quality monitoring. There was not a single word on underwater drones in that plan. But in the end, the whole project was about underwater drones.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was quite fascinating. And well, in the end, that project was so successful and so many people got interested that we decided to start a company in Dymo.
I see
that's
the yellow submarine, the yellow drone.
Yeah, the yellow drone. We have now a lot of other drones as well. It's not the yellow one we only use for PR. It never goes in the water. Because we're now already, I think, the generation 9 of the underwater drones already in 3 years. So it's going quite rapidly.
So you buy the drone and you customize it, or you
Exactly.
buy
So it's a combination of the right sensors and the right underwater drones. But we're now also technically developing our own dedicated underwater drone. So that would be really an in-Dymo drone.
And
we're working on that as well.
What sensors do they have? What are you measuring?
This is a flexible system, so depending on what you want to know, you can put different sensors on it. But in generally, we're interested in, for sure, the oxygen level, what's happening under the floating, but also temperature effects. We want to know about nutrients. That's very important. Salinity, if we're depending on which system we are. Turbidity is something we want to know about. more recently also algae sensors. What kind of algae?
I would love that. Joker.
And also, yeah, so those are the things that we generally measure. But yeah, if there's a new type of problem and we can find a sensor for it, we see how we can integrate it in the underwater drone.
And how do you collect the data? Is it sent? As it
depends. We have two types. We have one with, let's say, a teacher cable, so it's connected to a laptop or computer, and then you can send real time to the computer. You can even look through your, you can see real time what the drone is seeing. But we also have a system without a cable, and then we take the drone to our office and then get all the data later.
Wow, both are equal.
We're also, but we're also, of course, interested in data transfer underwater. We could make that more sophisticated. And, things like underwater GPS, that's something we have now also working on to implement that in our drones. So that for each measurement point, we know the exact coordinates.
Oh, wow.
That leads to the possibility to create three-dimensional underwater quality maps. So 3D visualizations of water quality. So those are the things we're working on, and it's very interesting. Yeah.
That sounds so cool.
Yeah.
And each place requires a different type of drone, because
it depends on the circumstance. We have different types, and depending on what we want to know and about the water system characteristics, we select a drone or buy a new one. We have quite a lot of drones, but sometimes we use. So,
I met Rui.
Yeah, Rui. Yeah, he's a fascinating guy, isn't he?
Yeah. Yes. And he told me that one day he came. So Rui is the person who works at Indaimo, the drone company.
Absolutely.
For those who are listening to us, and he told me that one day he came to the office and you were there, and you said, "Yeah, I just bought a drone." That's how it started. I just bought it.
That's how it goes. Yeah, and then of course we customize it with the right sensors, and it really becomes a water quality ecology drone. And Rui, I think Rui is the most experienced underwater drone operator and expert in the world, probably, because he's been working on it now for 3 or 4 years. And for me, of course, I'm also involved, but yes, I also do a lot with Rotterdam University and with Blue 21. And so for me, it's one of the things I do. And Rui is working all the time with Indaimo.
Wow.
Although he's really motivated also to do a PhD in this field. So next to his work at Indaimo.
Wow. Yeah. But it's really cool because he can mix both.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I love it. Let's see, what else do I have here? Oh, I wanted to ask you, what did you mean by the intrinsic value of nature?
Yes, I think that in our current society, we tend to view nature or animals or plants purely for their instrumentic value, so the value they can provide to us by providing food or whatever. But I think it's very important to acknowledge the fact that even without providing such specific products or services to us, nature has a value on its own.
Yes.
By the beauty of the system and also the things how it works. You gave some really interesting observations how we can learn from evolution and complex systems, but even without all those, so I think we should also we tend to connect value to utility, so things that can be used by us have a certain value, but I argue that nature has a much bigger value than that.
Absolutely.
So if a certain animal got extinct, we lose something also of the system that we are part of, even if it's from economic terms might have been completely no value at all. It has a value. So, and I think it's in cities, human beings and nature have been disconnected, whereas of course evolutionary and historically and even genetically, we are an intrinsic part of the ecosystem. So we see humans on one hand and ecosystems on the other hand, but we also need to think about cities, how we can make the reconnection. Because how can people experience nature and be part of it and have a positive influence on it? And I think if we do that, it will be very obvious, more obvious to people that nature has an intrinsic value and not only a utility value.
Yeah. It comes from language. We say humans animals. And we don't
Exactly.
realize
Yeah.
are animals too.
Yes, and I think in the end, of course, yeah, you're right. And so I think that's also a transition that we need to make. And well, if we design floating cities in such a way that they reconnect to nature, have a positive impact on the ecosystems from design, but also from monitoring, it needs to be proven by intelligent monitoring systems such as underwater drones.
Yes.
I think floating cities can also play a role there, because what we have seen with the underwater drones is ecological development under floating platforms. So places where there used to be no nature, we see small shrimps under floating platforms, fish, seaweed attached, shell mussels, other shellfish, all. So floating cities, if we do it the right way, if we do not only design the buildings above the water level, but also under the water level,
Yes.
it can contribute to creating new ecological habitat, and also the possibility for people to experience that and value that.
What places have you analyzed with the underwater drone?
I couldn't give you a number, but let's say that we had a very big team of very enthusiastic students, and as soon as they found a new floating project somewhere in the Netherlands, they went there with the drones. So I couldn't claim we have done all floating projects in the Netherlands, but definitely the large majority of all projects that we know of, we did.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so it was a very interesting project to do. And what we found is that for the small projects that we have, we don't know about large projects because there are hardly any large projects. But the small projects we have, we found hardly any influence on the water quality. And from an ecological point of view, actually, we often found positive impacts. So new habitat, new ecological systems emerging.
And we can see that under boats, actually, when boats have been docked for a
Absolutely, yeah. True, yeah.
life starts attaching.
Yes, it's also not so surprising, but yeah, we have now also proven that it's the case, which helps, of course, in proposing new projects and moving forward with the floating urban development.
And for seasteading.
Also, yeah, I think so. I think also definitely also for the floating island project in French Polynesia will be very important to do ecological monitoring and ecological design, and have smart monitoring systems, including underwater drones.
Yes.
I think it's also very smart to make that open source, so other people can also have a look at what's happening.
Yes.
And I think that's also something that, in terms of sustainability, having a nice vision or a corporate sustainability report or something is no longer enough. You really have to show what you're doing and make it accessible to people and transparent, and
Indeed.
so that they, and make it available for the data, make the data available. And also if it appears that the impact's not so good, that you get a chance to do something about it.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that we are considering in the floating island. That's why your team actually proposed having a parallel lagoon to monitor and compare the water quality of both places.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And another lagoon that doesn't have systems.
Yes, I think that's very good to have to compare two situations, because that's often the way to do this kind of research and actually prove something. And that would be, I think, if you can create cities that clean the water, that have a positive impact on air quality, that create new ecological systems, that would be fantastic. And I think that's the way to go. Also and it sounds very unrealistic, because cities now have such a negative impact.
Yeah, parasitic.
On those things and parasitic systems, but actually all the technologies to do this are available already. So we need to bring them together and apply them in these kind of projects.
A few days ago, Igor Rajikov, our co-founder of Blue Frontiers, told me that he met you.
Absolutely, yes, that was a pleasure.
That you simply found each other without planning it at an event called Floating Futures.
Exactly, yeah, it was quite fascinating because it appeared he was sitting right next to me, and I knew Carina had told me, like, Igor's also here, you need to meet him, and I said, yeah, sure, and he introduced me to him. But then actually he was, without me knowing it, he was sitting next to me.
Wow!
I'd like to introduce myself, and then I saw his name badge. I said, hey, that's okay, that's fantastic. Yeah.
Wow! Oh, here you are, the person I've been.
There were 130 people there, so it was quite a coincidence. Yeah.
Wow! Maybe it was meant to be.
Yeah, maybe, who knows? Yeah. I had a very good conversation, and I'm very happy to have to meet him, yeah, for sure.
Thanks for joining us on the Blue Frontiers podcast. To learn more about our work and find out how you can support the project, visit blue-frontiers.com or visit our social channels. You can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at Blue Frontiers, or shoot us a note via our website. If you learned something and enjoyed the show, tell a friend or leave us a positive review on iTunes or wherever you're listening. Don't forget to subscribe to our show and remember to join us for the next episode. See you next time.